The streets of Midtown Manhattan were alive with their usual rhythm, blaring horns, flashing neon billboards, and waves of people flowing like a restless tide. The towering skyscrapers loomed overhead, their glass facades reflecting the golden glow of the street lights. On Fifth Avenue and West 52nd Street, the heart of New York's financial district, businessmen in expensive suits hurried past luxury storefronts, their polished leather shoes clicking against the pavement. Among them was Brian Thompson, the CEO of UnitedHealthcare, walking out of an upscale restaurant after an evening meeting. His tailored suit was immaculate, his posture straight and composed, a man who carried power in every step. He paused for a moment under the bright lights, adjusting his cufflinks, unaware that someone had been watching him for weeks. From the shadows of a nearby alley, a lone figure stood still. Luigi Mangione. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by a hood. The city's noise drowned out his deep, steady breaths. His fingers tightened around the straps of his backpack, feeling the weight of the steel inside. His heart pounded not out of fear, but from the clarity of his purpose. As Thompson took a step forward, heading toward his private car, Mangione moved. He was calm, almost methodical, as he closed the distance. Then, in a flash, he reached into his backpack. A single motion. A cold metallic glint. The sound of a suppressed shot cracked through the air, quick, precise, and deadly. The moment froze. Pedestrians gasped, eyes wide with shock, their bodies locked in place before chaos erupted. Screams pierced the night. Thompson's body staggered back, his briefcase slipping from his grasp, papers fluttering like dying birds. Mangione didn't run. He didn't need to. He calmly slipped his weapon back into the bag, turned on his heel, and walked toward a nearby alley where an electric bike was waiting for him. Within seconds, he was gone, vanishing into the endless arteries of the city. The corporate king had fallen. And his executioner had disappeared without a trace. The name Luigi Mangione wasn't familiar to most people. He wasn't a career criminal, nor a well-known activist. But for those who had crossed paths with him, there was something undeniably unsettling about the man. Born in New Jersey, Mangione had once been a medical worker, spending years in hospital corridors, witnessing firsthand the suffering of patients who were denied treatment due to financial barriers. But his real grudge began years earlier, when he himself had been a victim of the system. A workplace accident had left him with severe lung damage. He had trusted his insurance to cover the necessary treatments, but instead, he received denial letters filled with legal jargon and corporate indifference. Denied. Defend. Depose. The same words he would later etch onto the casings of his bullets. As time passed, his bitterness grew into something darker. He became obsessed with cases of corporate injustice, studying men who had fought against the system in violent ways. One name stood out to him more than any other: George Metesky, the infamous Mad Bomber of New York. In the 1950s, George Metesky planted more than 20 homemade bombs across New York City, his personal vendetta against Con Edison for denying his workers' compensation claim. His actions caused panic and terror, yet he remained elusive for years, writing letters to the press under the initials F.P., which he later revealed stood for fair play. To the world, he was a criminal. But to Luigi Mangione, he was something else. A man who stood up against the system. Mangione began writing his own manifestos, mirroring Miteschi's style: long, rambling letters condemning corporate greed. He scribbled notes in his journal, detailing ways in which one man could fight back against an empire. But while Miteschi had used bombs, Mangione chose the precision of a single bullet. His planning was meticulous. Months of tracking Thompson's schedule, observing his habits, mapping escape routes. He knew when the CEO would be vulnerable. All that was left was the final act. When the NYPD arrived at the crime scene, they were met with chaos. A crowd had formed, a mix of shocked witnesses and panicked bystanders, all struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Detectives scanned the scene, searching for surveillance footage, a dropped item, anything that could lead them to the suspect. What they found was more disturbing than they had expected. Near the body, one single bullet casing lay on the ground. Upon closer inspection, investigators saw words engraved into the brass surface. Deny. Defend. Depose. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was a message. For days, Luigi Mangione vanished. But he hadn't disappeared completely. His journey led him away from the towering buildings of Manhattan and into the quiet rural roads of Pennsylvania. Investigators, analyzing GPS data from the abandoned electric bike, traced his escape route leading toward Altoona. It was here, in a cheap roadside motel, that Mangione was finally found. When police entered the dimly lit room, they discovered him seated at a small wooden desk, calmly writing in his journal. Beside him, a backpack, its contents confirming everything. Inside, they found the 9mm pistol, wiped clean but still carrying traces of gunpowder. Fake identification, indicating he had planned further movement. A 3-page handwritten manifesto, condemning corporate corruption. As officers moved in, Mangione didn't resist. He simply looked up, exhaled, and whispered, "Fair play." Months later, the trial of Luigi Mangione would begin, drawing national attention. Some saw him as a dangerous criminal, a man who had taken justice into his own hands. Others viewed him as a symbol of deep frustration, a man pushed to the edge by a system that seemed untouchable. Prosecutors revealed that Mangione had studied not just Miteschi but also Ted Kaczynski, the infamous Unabomber. He had highlighted passages from Kaczynski's Industrial Society and its future, even leaving a review online calling it interesting. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. The verdict? Guilty. Mangione was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But even from behind bars, his case sparked conversations about corporate power, wealth disparity, and the lengths some people will go when they believe they have nothing left to lose. His story became a modern-day reflection of the same frustrations that had fueled radicals of the past. And the question remained: was he just a criminal? Or was he a man who saw himself as a revolutionary? The night of the 15th was cold, but Midtown Manhattan was still alive with movement. At the intersection of 5th Avenue and West 52nd Street, neon lights flickered against the polished exteriors of designer storefronts. The air smelled of hot pretzels from a street vendor mixed with the faint aroma of expensive cologne from businessmen passing by. The sidewalks, though not as crowded as during the day, still had a steady flow of pedestrians, some heading home, others indulging in the city's nightlife. From the entrance of an upscale restaurant, Brian Thompson emerged. His tailored navy suit was sharp, his Italian leather shoes clicked against the pavement. He adjusted his watch, glanced at his phone, and exhaled a long day of high-stakes meetings behind him. Across the street, a shadow moved. Luigi Mangione. Dressed in dark clothing, his black balaclava concealed his face, leaving only his piercing eyes visible. His gloved hands gripped the straps of his backpack, fingers brushing against the cold metal of the 9mm pistol concealed within. He stood motionless in the shadows of a building entrance, observing Thompson with quiet intensity. His heart rate was steady. This was not impulse, this was execution. At 9:37 p.m., Thompson took a step toward the curb, raising a hand to signal his driver waiting just a few feet away. Mangione moved. A few quick strides and he was within range. One smooth motion, one practiced movement. He unzipped his backpack, reached inside. A metallic click. The shot rang out sharp but controlled, cutting through the city's symphony. Brian Thompson jerked forward, his body stiffening as the force of impact took hold. His briefcase slipped from his fingers, crashing onto the pavement, papers scattering into the night breeze like fallen leaves. For a fraction of a second, everything stood still. Then, a scream. The moment shattered. Chaos erupted. Pedestrians gasped, some ducking, others running. Cars honked wildly as drivers turned their heads, trying to process what had just happened. A woman's phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the concrete. Thompson's body crumpled onto the sidewalk, his head resting against the cold stone of the building behind him. The once powerful CEO, a titan of industry, was now just another motionless figure on the city streets. But Mangione? He didn't run. He stood for a second, his gloved hand slipping the pistol back into his bag, zipping it up with eerie calmness. Then, without hesitation, he turned, walked toward the curb, and straddled an electric bike that had been left leaning against a street sign, his escape route pre-planned to perfection. No panic. No rush. With smooth, deliberate movements, Mangione navigated the city streets, weaving between cars, heading north toward Central Park. Within moments, he was gone. The first 911 calls came in seconds after the gunshot. Shots fired 5th and 52nd. Someone's down. Within minutes, the area was swarmed with NYPD patrol units. Flashing red and blue lights painted the street in an eerie glow. Officers rushed onto the scene, securing the perimeter, their hands hovering near their holsters in case the threat remained. Detectives arrived shortly after, pushing past the crowd of horrified onlookers. Every witness had the same story: one shot, one man, an electric bike, and a seamless escape. Near the fallen briefcase, an officer noticed something small but unusual on the pavement. A bullet casing. Upon closer inspection, engraved onto the casing were 3 words: deny, defend, depose. Who was this man? And how had he just assassinated a corporate giant in the middle of New York and vanished into the night? The NYPD immediately launched an extensive manhunt. Detectives scoured security footage, tracing Mangione's movements backwards, from the moment of the shooting to where he had come from. What they found was chilling. Hours before the incident, Mangione had been captured on security cameras lingering near the restaurant, watching, waiting. He wasn't nervous, he was patient. He had scouted every angle, memorized every security blind spot, every camera rotation. Investigators traced his escape route through traffic cams heading straight into Central Park, where surveillance was sparse. Then, he disappeared. How could a man pull off such a clean escape? The answer lay in planning. Mangione had studied the layout of the city, anticipated the police response time, and knew exactly where the cameras would and wouldn't see him. This wasn't random, one investigator muttered, this guy knew exactly what he was doing. The FBI was called in, a multi-state fugitive search was now underway. But Mangione had one last trick up his sleeve. The chase was on. Papers are scattered on a desk, medical bills piled up, and a laptop screen flickers with search results on corporate lawsuits. The sound of a clock ticking in the background. Luigi Mangione was not an ordinary criminal. He wasn't a career outlaw, nor a common thief. He once had a respectable career, a life that seemed far from the world of violence. But something changed. Mangione had spent years working in the medical field. He understood the inner workings of healthcare, how insurance companies operated, how policies were written to maximize profits, and how patients could be left helpless by bureaucracy. But his life took a dark turn after a major personal setback. According to medical records, Mangione himself was diagnosed with a serious medical condition, a diagnosis that should have granted him immediate care. Yet, when he submitted his claim, he received a single-page denial letter. We regret to inform you that your requested treatment does not meet the criteria for coverage. He appealed. He fought. He filed complaints. But each response from the insurance company was the same: cold, clinical, detached. Deny. Defend. Depose. The same three words, again and again. Mangione felt like he was drowning. He had once believed in the system, trusted in its fairness. But now, that system had turned its back on him. And something inside him snapped. As months passed, his anger turned into an obsession. He began researching other individuals who had waged war against corporations, men who had taken extreme measures to fight back. Mitesky, a former Con Edison employee, had been injured in a workplace accident and denied proper compensation. He spent years plotting his revenge, planting over 20 bombs across New York City. His goal? To make those who wronged him suffer. Then, there was Ted Kaczynski. Kaczynski, a former mathematics professor, had written a 35,000-word manifesto condemning the technological and corporate elite, launching a deadly mail bomb campaign. These men were more than criminals to him. They were martyrs. Warriors against corruption. And now, he would become one too. In the weeks leading up to the attack, Mangione crafted his own manifesto. It was filled with rage against corporate greed, accusations of corruption, and a promise of justice. But it wasn't just words. It was a warning. These weren't random phrases. They were the very words used by health insurers when rejecting claims, words that had haunted Mangione for years. The night before the attack, he took one last look at his plan. And then, he vanished into the city. The flashing red and blue lights of NYPD patrol cars cast long shadows on the pavement. The streets of Midtown Manhattan hum with tension. Officers cordon off the scene, their radios crackling with urgent chatter. Crime scene investigators move methodically, their gloved hands collecting evidence under the harsh glow of streetlights. The moment the shot rang out, chaos erupted. Brian Thompson, one of the most powerful corporate figures in the country, lay motionless on the sidewalk. The upscale restaurant he had just exited was now the center of a crime scene. A detective, trench coat damp from the cold night air, steps onto the scene. He surveys the chaos, the flashing lights, the murmuring crowd, the discarded wine glass shattered on the pavement. This was no ordinary case. The New York Police Department knew they had to act fast. A high-profile target, a calculated attack, a suspect who had vanished without a trace. Time was ticking. Inside the NYPD forensics lab, a bullet casing sits under a bright examination light. The camera zooms in on the tiny inscriptions carved into the metal. The lead investigator narrows his eyes. Then came the first major clue. A bullet casing, retrieved from the scene, revealed something unusual. These weren't just random words. They were direct references to corporate tactics used to reject insurance claims. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a statement. Detectives exchange glances. This case had just become much bigger than a random act of violence. A hazy early morning in Central Park, dew clings to the grass as NYPD officers examine an abandoned electric bike near a park bench. The serial number is barely visible under layers of dirt. Less than a mile from the crime scene, investigators found something else. An electric bike, hastily left behind in a secluded part of Central Park. A detective runs a gloved hand over the handlebars, noticing a faint fingerprint smeared on the brake lever. CCTV footage was frustratingly inconclusive. Mangione had been careful to avoid security cameras. But the bike's GPS system. Back in the tech lab, a blinking red dot traces a path through the streets of New York on a digital map. The line moves fast, weaving through Midtown before stopping abruptly at Central Park. It showed an unusual travel pattern. From the crime scene to Central Park. Then, nothing. Mangione had vanished. A detective rubs his temples. Where the hell did he go next? A tense meeting room inside NYPD headquarters. Maps of the East Coast pinned to the wall. Officers and FBI agents hunched over reports. Then came the biggest breakthrough. A young officer rushes into the room, holding up a printout. We found something. GPS data had picked up something strange. A red dot appears on a new digital map, this time, in Altoona, Pennsylvania. It was a bus ticket purchase. Mangione had left the city. A grainy security cam image shows a man in a hooded sweatshirt boarding a late-night bus at Port Authority. His head is tilted down, but the resemblance is unmistakable. His destination? A small, inconspicuous motel in Altoona. The calm before the storm. A dimly lit motel hallway. The carpet is worn, the walls yellowed with age. A heavy silence lingers in the air. NYPD, working alongside Pennsylvania authorities, moved in. A SWAT team stacks outside room 214. A low voice murmurs into a radio, "We go in on my mark. 3, 2, 1. The door bursts open. Flashlights cut through the darkness. Hands where we can see them. Mangione didn't fight. He sits on the bed, his hands raised. His face is unreadable calm, even. On the nightstand. A backpack. A 9mm pistol. A fake ID. His manifesto. A detective picks up the 3-page letter, scanning its contents. The words corporate parasites and justice are underlined in heavy ink. The chase was over. But one question remained. Was Luigi Mangione just a desperate man? Or did he truly believe he was a hero? Courtroom footage. The room is silent except for the steady voice of the prosecution. The jury, a mix of men and women from different backgrounds, sit stiffly in their seats, their eyes shifting between the lawyers and the defendant. The weight of the case presses down on them. The trial of Luigi Mangione began 1 month after his arrest. The media frenzy was unavoidable. Outside the courthouse, reporters shove microphones into the faces of legal experts. Is this an act of terrorism or a desperate man's breaking point? They ask. Protesters stand with signs, some condemning Mangione, others questioning the ethics of corporate power. Inside, the prosecution wasted no time. They painted Mangione as a cold, calculated extremist, a man who had spent months researching corporate-related crimes, studying past attackers like George Metesky and Ted Kaczynski. A large screen in the courtroom flashes images, notes scribbled in a journal, highlighted passages from Kaczynski's manifesto, screenshots of online forums where Mangione ranted about corporate greed. His manifesto was damning evidence. Filled with anger, resentment, and a clear sense of mission, it laid out in painstaking detail his belief that corporations were parasites, draining the life out of the common citizen. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed woman with a commanding voice, walks toward the jury. This was not a man who snapped in a moment of passion, she says. This was a man who planned, who studied, who knew exactly what he was doing. Her words cut through the courtroom. Mangione sits silently at the defense table. His face is unreadable. Occasionally, he scribbles something in a notepad. His attorneys whisper urgently to him. The defense strategy took a different approach. They argued that Mangione was not a terrorist, not an extremist, but a man who had been pushed to the edge. His attorney, a weary-looking man with silver hair, adjusts his glasses. Mr. Mangione was a victim, too, he says. A victim of a system that failed him. They pointed to his denied medical coverage, the years of frustration, and the mental distress that spiraled into obsession. They brought in psychiatrists who described Mangione as a man suffering from severe paranoia, convinced that he was carrying out justice. A psychiatrist, calm but firm, takes the stand. In his mind, she explains, he believed he was doing something righteous. He saw himself as a protector of the weak, someone who had no choice but to act. But the prosecution pushed back. The lead prosecutor steps forward. "So, doctor," she says, "are you telling us that every person denied medical coverage is justified in murder?" The courtroom shifts uncomfortably. It was a delicate battle. Was Luigi Mangione a broken man? Or a dangerous ideologue? The jury files back into the courtroom. The air is thick with tension. Mangione sits up straighter, but his expression remains blank. After 3 days of deliberation, the verdict was read. A hush falls over the room as the judge speaks. "Luigi Mangione, for the crime of first-degree murder, we sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A gasp from the gallery. Some sigh in relief. Others shake their heads. Mangione did not react. He simply nodded once, as if he had already accepted his fate. The news spreads like wildfire. Cable news networks, social media, and talk shows dissect the trial from every angle. The case of Luigi Mangione was more than just a murder trial. A political commentator on TV, "The real question is what drove him to this point? How many others feel the same anger but never act on it?" Some called him a monster. Others called him a warning sign. A protest erupts outside the courthouse. "Fix the healthcare system," one sign reads. Another reads, "Justice for Brian Thompson." Did the system push a desperate man too far? Or was he always destined to become a killer? Luigi Mangione's case is not just another crime story. It is a symptom of something bigger. A montage of news footage, protesters outside pharmaceutical companies, families struggling with medical bills, a homeless man clutching a sign that reads, "Denied coverage." No options left. The gap between wealth and survival has never been more visible. A CEO, murdered in cold blood. A man who felt he had no other choice. Was he simply a killer with a grudge? Or was he a symbol of growing resentment, a man who acted on emotions that many feel but never express? Footage of UnitedHealthcare's headquarters. The sleek glass building stands tall against the city skyline, untouched, unchanged. Business continues as usual. Did his actions change anything? For every Luigi Mangione, how many others suffer in silence? It's a case that forces us to ask difficult questions. What happens when justice and desperation collide? Where do we draw the line between revenge and resistance? And most importantly, could this happen again? What do you think? Do you see Mangione as a criminal or a symptom of a broken system? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, and stay aware.